Are you suffering with sciatica and you're wondering whether it's a bulging disc or piriformis syndrome that's causing it? If you are, then this video is going to answer all the questions you have. Hi everybody, my name is Will Harlow and I'm the Over-Fifties and sciatica specialist physiotherapist here at HT Physio in Farnham. And today I'm going to be comparing and contrasting bulging discs and piriformis syndrome, telling you all about both problems and how to differentiate between the two so you can tell what's causing your sciatica. Now, before we dive into the content of the video, if you haven't already, please hit like on the video and subscribe to the channel using the link in the bottom right, because then you'll be the first to hear about our videos when they come out. Now that that's been said, let's talk about bulging discs, piriformis syndrome and sciatica and the relationship between the three. So the first thing to say here is that sciatica is a word that we use to describe a symptom that involves nerve pain running down the leg. And sciatica isn't a condition in and of itself, it's just a symptom that can be caused by lots of different conditions. And two of those conditions are bulging discs and piriformis syndrome. So when you've got sciatica, when you've got nerve pain running down the leg, it's very important to determine what is causing that sciatica. And some people will have their sciatica caused by disc problems like bulging discs, and others will have their sciatica caused by piriformis syndrome. And in the very first instance of looking at it, these two conditions can look very, very similar. So it's difficult for the layperson to tell which one is causing their problem. But in this video, we're going to talk about how the two things differ and how to tell the difference between them. So what we're going to do today, the plan for today's video is we're going to first talk about bulging discs, what they are and who gets them. Then we're going to do the same thing for piriformis syndrome. Then we're going to talk about some of the subtle symptoms that only bulging disc patients tend to have. Then we're going to do the same thing for piriformis syndrome. And then by the end of the video, you should have a good idea as to what's causing your sciatica. So let's start with a bulging disc and talk about what a bulging disc actually is and how it occurs in the first place. So when we're talking about a bulging disc, what we're talking about is an injury to the intervertebral discs that sit between the vertebra in the spine. And the discs are basically flexible structures which have a tough outer shell of what we call collagen fibers, and in the middle there's a fluid center. Now, if this outer layer of the disc starts to weaken and the fluid center starts to push towards that weak area, it can form what we call a bulge, which looks something like that. So a bulge can come in and out. It often depends on where we are in terms of sitting or moving. Sometimes it will be bulging out, sometimes it will be back into the center of the disc. But if that bulge comes out at such an angle that it touches that yellow thing there, that's a nerve root and that is going to cause sciatica. So that's what a bulging disc is. Now, piriformis syndrome is actually very different. So the bulging disc is obviously a condition that affects the lower back, but the piriformis syndrome is actually a condition that affects the hip. So the piriformis is a muscle that lives inside the buttock. It's very deep. It sits all the way underneath the gluteal muscles, which are the big ones that make up the buttock, and it runs from your sacrum out here and attaches to your thigh bone called the femur. So it sits about here if we're looking at it on a skeleton, and if we're looking at it on a person, the piriformis is roughly from here running out to the side of the leg. So this is about where the muscle belly of the piriformis is. Now, piriformis syndrome is a condition that we think of as mechanical. So it forms slowly over time, and it's usually forming because the piriformis muscle has become very tight. Now, the piriformis muscle is only a very small muscle, so it's just designed to support the hip. But in people who have mechanical problems with their hip, sometimes the piriformis muscle is having to do far too much work. Now, if it's overworked, it can cope with that for a couple of months. But if that overworking continues for a long, long time, then the piriformis muscle will get so tight that it starts to sometimes compress the sciatic nerve. Now, there's a little bit of controversy in the literature about how many people are susceptible to piriformis syndrome. And the reason is that we tend to think that only about 10% of the population actually have the potential to get this condition. And the reason is because 10% of the population have a piriformis muscle that splits in half, and in the middle of it, the sciatic nerve runs through. The other 90%, the sciatic nerve passes quite happily past the piriformis, so it doesn't go anywhere near it. But in that 10%, the sciatic nerve dissects through the muscle. So if those people get a tight piriformis, that can pinch the sciatic nerve and cause sciatica. So in reality, piriformis syndrome is probably not quite as common as many people think it is, because there's not that many people who are actually susceptible to it. So those are the two conditions. And let's talk about some of the symptoms that only one type of condition would get and how we can differentiate between the two. So let's first talk about bulging discs and the kind of symptoms people with bulging discs get. Now, in addition to sciatica, which is nerve pain that runs down the leg, people with bulging discs often have back pain. The reason they have back pain is because the injury's in the back, and when you get a bulging disc, often the muscles in the back start to lock up to try and protect it. So quite often, not always, but quite often, people with bulging discs will have first developed back pain, then they get their sciatica. Now, it's possible for someone with piriformis syndrome to have back pain, but most people don't. They just have buttock pain and then the sciatica. So if you have back pain, that's a big clue that it's possibly a bulging disc causing your sciatica. The second clue we look for when we're trying to decide which is the cause of the sciatica is that bulging discs can often start pretty suddenly. Now, this is not always the case. Sometimes they can happen slowly over time, particularly in older people. But for many people, a bulging disc starts because someone was bending forward and trying to pick up something heavy. They felt something go in their back, and that's when the bulge started. Now, contrast that with piriformis syndrome, and the onset of that is almost always very slow. It happens slowly over time. So if your pain started suddenly, that's another clue that it could be a bulging disc. Now, the third sign we look for that would suggest this is a bulging disc is that for most people who have either of these two conditions, the bulging disc is more painful. So if your sciatica is very, very severe, then that suggests it's more likely to be a bulging disc or a herniated disc. If your sciatica is quite mild and more of like a nagging pain, then that suggests it could be piriformis syndrome. Now, these rules are never taken in isolation. It's important for me to say that. So we always use these in the overall picture, not in isolation. Some people I meet, many people I meet do break one or two of these rules. So it's very common for this not always to be the case. But generally speaking, bulging discs tend to have more painful sciatica than piriformis syndrome. Now, the next thing we look for that would suggest that the problem is due to bulging discs is the fact that the pain tends to respond to spinal movements. So if you have a bulging disc, what usually happens is that when you bend forward to pick something up from the floor, the sciatica gets worse. And when you stand upright, the sciatica feels a bit better. Now, it might also be the case that if you twist your spine, the sciatica feels worse. And when you stay straight, it feels better. But usually with a bulging disc, there'll be some movement of the spine that triggers the sciatica and you think, oh, I shouldn't do that again. Now, with piriformis syndrome, if you're bending the spine, if you're twisting, if you're rotating, nothing will really happen to the sciatica. It won't make a huge difference. And that's because the problem is not in the spine, it's down in the hip. So check your spinal movements. If you've noticed a clear pattern, again, that suggests it's more likely to be a bulging disc than it does piriformis syndrome. And then the final thing that would suggest that this could well be a bulging disc and not piriformis syndrome is weakness in one of the muscle groups of the legs. Now, bulging discs, as I said, tend to have more severe symptoms than piriformis syndrome. And one of the quite severe symptoms that people can get from bulging discs is weakness in one of the muscles in the legs. So if your disc bulges out and it traps a nerve, that nerve can't supply the muscle group in the leg anymore, which is its target muscle, and that muscle becomes weak. Now, because piriformis syndrome doesn't tend to cause too much of an entrapment of the sciatic nerve, just an irritation, the weakness doesn't tend to be there with piriformis syndrome. So if you've developed weakness in one of the muscles in the legs, again, that suggests that it's a bulging disc problem and not piriformis syndrome. Now let's talk about some of the symptoms that would suggest that this problem is piriformis syndrome and not a bulging disc. So the first one is that there doesn't tend to be any back pain for most people with piriformis syndrome. Now obviously this isn't a hard and fast rule because some people have back pain and piriformis syndrome. But if the injury started and it felt like it was just pain in the buttock going down into the leg, that suggests it could be piriformis syndrome and not a bulging disc. Now the second thing that suggests that it could be piriformis syndrome is that the problem tends to come on very, very slowly. So with bulging discs, most people find that the problem comes on quite quickly, either over the course of a couple of minutes or over the course of a few days. With piriformis syndrome, it tends to come on over the course of a few weeks to months. So a slow onset of pain suggests more the piriformis route. Now the third symptom that suggests it could be piriformis syndrome, as I've said before, is that the pain tends to be a little bit less severe. So it can be more of a nagging pain rather than a very excruciating, I can't move type of pain. So if the piriformis syndrome is there, it often causes pain when you're sitting and feels a bit throbby, and then when you get up, the pain starts to go away. With a bulging disc, things might be much more severe. Now, the next thing that suggests that the problem could be piriformis syndrome is a very tender buttock region. So if you've noticed that it really hurts to sit on your bum, there's a sore spot there, and if you get your fingers and you press around on your buttock and it's really tender, that can suggest a piriformis syndrome type problem. And that's because you're touching that sore muscle, the one that's got very tight, and it's causing irritation. So if you've got a very sore buttock, that suggests again it's piriformis syndrome rather than a bulging disc. Now another symptom that can suggest that piriformis syndrome is the cause is that your pain is relieved when you sit on a donut cushion. Now this is precisely for the reason that your piriformis muscle is tight and sitting on it is compressing it. If you sit on a ring cushion, so one of these blow-up cushions with a gap in the middle, and you put your buttock on that gap and the pain goes away, that suggests it's more likely to be piriformis problems. Now, most people who have bulging discs and or piriformis syndrome will find that sitting is uncomfortable. But if you've got a bulging disc, the pressure cushion is not likely to change it because your spine is still in a sitting position. Contrast that with piriformis syndrome, you've taken the pressure off the buttock and that should relieve the pain. So that's another thing we might look for. Another symptom that suggests piriformis syndrome is the cause is that the pain slowly gets worse when you do a lot of walking, running or cycling. Now piriformis syndrome is actually quite common in runners, cyclists and triathletes, people who do lots and lots of repetitive movement, so the long distance type events. And that's because if they've got a mechanical problem in the hip and they're running, for example, 20 miles, they might find that over time, the first 10 miles is okay, but then things start to tighten up. So if you notice the pain gets progressively worse while you exercise, that could be piriformis syndrome at work. And then the final sign we look for to suggest it might well be piriformis syndrome is that when you bend, when you twist, and when you move your spine, it doesn't really affect your pain. So if that's the case, and you've got piriformis syndrome, you can move your spine as much as you want and you probably won't feel any change to your sciatica. If you have a bulging disc, then that would be the opposite. So those are the differences between them. It's important now to notice that there are a lot of similarities between the conditions. So they can both cause pain in the same pattern, they can both be worse when sitting, they can both take quite a long time to get better, and they can both cause pins and needles and numbness. But if you look at the differences between them, I think it's clear to see when we look quite closely there are some subtle differences, and hopefully this video has given you the guidance you need to differentiate between the two. Anyway, that's all I had for you today. I hope this video has been useful. If it has, then drop me a comment below and let me know. And if you want to get more from me, please feel free to pick up a copy of my book. It's called Thriving Beyond 50 and you can find it on Amazon using the link below this video. It's got loads more information about bulging discs and conditions like piriformis syndrome inside. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate your time and I look forward to catching up with you on the next video.